Faster! They're closing in!
I can't! My legs!
Keep moving! Don't stop! They're getting closer!
We can't stop!
Stay with me! After them!
The first sign that something was wrong was not a body, not a sound, not even a struggle. It was the silence, a deep, unnatural silence that settled over the forest as the hunters moved deeper into it. Because a group that large should not disappear without leaving something behind. And yet, step by step, they walked into a place that seemed to swallow everything. Welcome to Story of the Black Past, where we uncover hidden stories, powerful truths, and forgotten moments from history. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you're watching this. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Thank you for being here. Stay until the end because this story will keep you thinking. You will not want to miss a single moment. Now relax, remove all distractions, and pay close attention as we begin. They called them heavy, slow, easy to catch. Men who did not look like they could run far. Men who seemed out of place in a chase that demanded speed. And that was exactly why the hunters were confident, because confidence often grows from underestimation. The two men were known among the enslaved by different names, names that carried respect, but among those who hunted them, they were reduced to something simple, something easy, something that could be handled without effort. Their names were Kojo and Bako, and they had already gone further than anyone expected. The plantation they escaped from had sent word quickly, describing them in ways that made the task seem simple. Large men, not fast, not skilled, not dangerous, just two bodies that could not hide for long. But the description was wrong, not completely, but enough, because what they lacked in speed, they carried in something else, knowledge, not just of the land, but of survival, of patience, of how to move when being watched, and more importantly, of how to disappear. The forest they entered was not open land, not clear ground. It was dense, layered, filled with paths that did not reveal themselves easily, with ground that changed without warning, with sounds that carried in ways that could mislead those who did not understand them. Kojo and Bako knew this, not because they had been told, but because they had learned, over time, through movement, through observation, through survival. The hunters, nearly 50 in number, entered with confidence, armed, prepared, certain that numbers would give them advantage, because numbers often create a sense of control, but control requires understanding. And that was what they lacked. At first the trail was clear, footprints, broken branches, signs that suggested movement, direction, progress, and the hunters followed easily, their voices steady, their steps sure, believing they were closing in. But the deeper they moved, the more things changed. The trail became less clear, the signs less obvious, the ground softer, then harder, then uneven. The sounds of the forest shifted, less movement, less noise, more silence, and silence in a place like that is never empty. Some of the hunters began to notice it, the change, the difference, but confidence is slow to fade, especially in numbers. They continued, deeper, further, following what they believed was still a trail, but what they did not see was that the trail had already changed, not disappeared, changed, redirected, controlled, because Kojo and Bako were no longer running. They were leading, not away but through spaces they understood, through paths they had chosen, through terrain that did not favor those who chased, but those who knew. The first man disappeared without sound, not a cry, not a struggle, just absence, one moment present, the next, gone. The others noticed quickly, but confusion replaced clarity, because there was no sign of what had happened, no mark, no trace, only space where someone had been. They called out, moved closer together, adjusted their formation, but uncertainty had already entered, and once uncertainty enters, it changes everything. Kojo and Bako moved silently, not fast, not rushing, but with purpose, because this was no longer escape, it was control. They knew the ground, The weak spots, the hidden drops, the places where one step could become a fall, the places where noise could be turned into misdirection. The hunters moved again, more cautious. Now, more aware, but still moving forward, because turning back would mean admitting something they were not ready to accept, that they had lost control. The second man fell deeper, not disappearing, but taken by the ground itself, a hidden space, a break beneath his weight, and the sound that followed, though brief, was enough to change the air completely. Now fear had shape, now uncertainty had form, but it was too late, because they were already inside, deep, surrounded, not by people but by environment, by knowledge, by something they could not fight directly. Kojo and Bako did not need to face them. Not all of them, not at once. They only needed to guide, to shift, to wait, and the forest did the rest. The hunters tried to regroup, tried to organize, tried to regain the control they believed they still had, but the space around them had changed, not physically, but in meaning. Because now they were not chasing, they were inside something they did not understand. And every step forward was no longer progress, it was risk. And as the forest closed in, as the silence grew heavier, as the numbers slowly began to fall, one truth became clear. They had not entered a place, they had entered a plan. The escape had not begun the night they ran. It had started long before that, in moments that seemed ordinary, in movements that looked like routine, in actions that no one thought to question, because the most effective plans are often built in plain sight. Kojo and Bako had worked the land for years, not just as laborers, but as observers, watching how the seasons changed the ground, how rain softened certain areas, how dry periods hardened others, how paths formed naturally, and how they disappeared again. They paid attention to details others ignored, the way water moved after a storm, the way roots lifted the soil in hidden places, the way certain areas looked stable but were not, and over time, these observations became knowledge, not written, not spoken openly, but remembered, stored, connected. The forest was not unknown to them, it was familiar. Not in every part, not completely, but enough to understand how it behaved, how it could protect, and how it could be used. Before they ever decided to run, they had already begun to prepare, not with obvious actions, but with small adjustments, slight changes to paths, subtle disturbances in areas where attention would not fall, creating conditions that would later matter. They did not build traps in the way hunters expect, not with tools or structures that could be easily seen or dismantled. They used what was already there, the natural weaknesses of the land, the unstable ground, the hidden drops, the areas where one step could lead to something more. And because these things were natural, they could not be easily recognized as part of a plan. The hunters followed what they believed was a trail, but that trail had been shaped, not entirely false, but not entirely true either, leading them through specific areas, guiding their movement without them realizing it. Kojo and Bako had slowed their pace deliberately, not because they were tired, but because speed was not their advantage, control was, and control required timing, spacing, understanding how the hunters would react. They knew that a group that large would not move as one unit, not completely. There would be gaps, differences in pace, moments where attention shifted, and those moments created opportunities. The first disappearance had not been an accident, it had been allowed. A man stepping into a place where the ground gave way, a place Kojo and Bako had tested before, a place that looked solid until weight was applied in the wrong way. The second fall had been guided, not forced, but directed. A slight shift in the path, a subtle change in movement, enough to bring the hunters into alignment with the terrain that would do the rest. The hunters began to understand something was wrong, but understanding without full knowledge is limited. It creates awareness, but not control, and without control, reactions become uncertain. They try to slow down, to observe more carefully, but slowing down in unfamiliar terrain creates its own problems. It increases tension, increases hesitation, and hesitation can be just as dangerous as rushing. Kojo and Bako moved ahead, then stopped, then moved again, not in a straight line, not in a predictable pattern. Because predictability leads to capture, and they had no intention of being predictable, they listened, constantly, to the movement behind them, to the sounds of feet on ground, to the shifts in voice, because sound carries information. It reveals position, it reveals confusion, it reveals fear, and fear was beginning to grow. The hunters were no longer speaking with confidence, their voices lower, more cautious, their movements tighter, closer together, but that closeness created another weakness because when people group too tightly in unstable terrain, they increase the chance of multiple failures, and that is exactly what began to happen. One misstep, then another, not all at once, but enough. Enough to slow them further, enough to break their rhythm, enough to make progress feel uncertain. Kojo and Bako did not need to see every moment. They understood the pattern. They knew that once the group reached a certain level of confusion, the environment would begin to do more of the work, because confusion leads to mistakes, and mistakes in a place like that are costly. The forest itself became part of the plan, not as something controlled, but as something understood, something that could be anticipated, used, relied upon to behave in certain ways under certain conditions. The hunters began to realize something deeper, not just that they were struggling, but that they were being led, not randomly, not by chance, but by someone who knew exactly where they were going. That realization changed everything, because now they were not just dealing with terrain, they were dealing with intention, and intention is far more difficult to fight. They tried to turn back, some of them. But turning back was no longer simple, because the path behind them was not as clear as they believed. The same confusion that affected their movement forward now affected their movement back. Kojo and Bako had not just guided them deeper. They had removed the clarity of exit, not completely, but enough to create hesitation, enough to delay, and delay, in a situation like this, is dangerous. The numbers began to shrink, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. One here, another there. Each loss small in isolation, but significant in total, and with each one, the balance shifted further. The hunters, once confident, now uncertain. The ones being chased, now in control. And as that shift continued, as the forest closed in, as the understanding grew that this was not a simple pursuit, one truth became unavoidable. They were no longer hunting. They were being drawn through something they did not fully understand. And the deeper they moved, the less likely it became that they would leave the same way they entered. The moment panic began was not marked by a loud shout or a sudden rush of movement. It came quietly, in the way the hunters started to look at each other differently, in the way their steps became uneven, in the way their voices lost the steady tone they had carried when they first entered the forest. At first they tried to hold their formation, to maintain the structure that had given them confidence, but structure depends on clarity, and clarity had already been lost, replaced by uncertainty, by doubt, by the growing realization that they did not fully understand where they were or what they were facing. One man stopped moving forward, not out of defiance but out of hesitation. He looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, the space that now felt unfamiliar. And in that moment of stillness, others began to slow as well, the forward motion breaking into fragments, small groups forming, each unsure of what the next step should be. Voices rose slightly, not loud but tense, questions without clear answers, directions given but not followed with confidence, because no one could say with certainty which way was right anymore. That was when the first argument began, not about fear, but about direction. One group wanted to push forward, believing that continuing was the only way to regain control, while another wanted to turn back, to retrace their steps, to leave before things became worse. But the problem was simple. No one knew which direction truly led out. And without that knowledge, every choice felt like risk. Kojo and Bako listened, from a distance, still, patient, because they understood that panic does not need to be forced. It grows naturally when conditions are right. And now, the conditions were perfect. The forest no longer felt like a place to move through. It felt like something that surrounded them, something that shifted depending on where they stepped, because every direction now carried uncertainty. The hunters tried to mark their path, breaking branches, leaving signs, but the environment worked against them. The ground uneven, the vegetation thick, the signs becoming lost among everything else, because marking a path requires stability, and stability was gone. Another man fell, not into a trap, but through misjudgment, a step taken with too much confidence, on ground that couldn't hold it. The sound of his fall echoed briefly, then disappeared, swallowed by the same silence that had been growing since they entered. Now the fear was visible, not hidden, not controlled. It showed in their faces, in their movements, in the way they began to stay closer together, not for strategy, but for comfort. And that closeness became another problem, because when people move too tightly in uncertain terrain, they lose space, lose awareness, become dependent on each other's decisions, and when those decisions are wrong, the consequences multiply. One man pushed forward too quickly, another tried to pull back, their movements collided, balance lost, control broken. And in that moment, the forest did what it had been waiting to do. Another fall, another absence, and now, no one could deny it. This was not just difficult terrain, this was something else, something working against them, something they could not see, but could feel. The idea began to form, not fully, not clearly, but enough. They were being led, not chased, led, and that realization brought something deeper than fear. It brought loss of control, because once a person understands that their movement is being shaped by something outside their control, their confidence breaks, their decisions weaken, their actions become reactive instead of deliberate. Kojo and Bako moved again, not to attack, not to confront, but to shift the space once more, to guide, to adjust, to continue the pattern, because this was not about speed, not about strength, but about endurance, about allowing the environment and the fear within it to do the work. The hunters began to turn on each other, not violently, not completely, but in words, in blame, in frustration, because when people cannot control what is around them, they often look for control within their group, and that creates division. Division weakens structure, and structure was the only thing they had left. Another attempt to organize, another attempt to choose a direction, but each attempt took longer. Each decision carried more hesitation, because now every step felt like it could be the wrong one. The forest closed in further, not physically, but mentally, because their perception had changed. What once looked like open space now looked uncertain. What once felt manageable now felt dangerous, and that shift was irreversible. Kojo and Bako did not need to rush, did not need to act directly, because they had already done the most important thing. They had changed the nature of the chase, turned it from pursuit into confusion, turned numbers into weakness, turned confidence into doubt, and once those changes take hold, the outcome becomes inevitable. The hunters were no longer moving as a group, they were fragments, pieces, each trying to survive within a space they did not understand. And as the numbers continued to drop, as the forest continued to guide, as the panic continued to grow, one truth became undeniable. They were not going to leave, not the way they came, not as they were, because the deeper they moved, the more they lost, not just direction, but control. And without control, there is no escape. The collapse did not happen all at once. It came in stages, small breaks that turned into larger ones, moments where structure failed, where decisions could not be agreed upon, where the group that had entered together no longer moved as one. By this point, the hunters were no longer thinking about capture, no longer focused on their original purpose. Survival had replaced everything. Every thought, every step, every choice was now driven by the need to get out, to find a path, to escape. The space that had turned against them But escape requires direction, and direction was gone. Some tried to move quickly, believing that speed would carry them through, but speed in uncertain ground only led to more mistakes, more missteps, more moments where the land beneath them did not respond the way they expected. Others slowed down, stepping carefully, testing each movement, but caution without knowledge creates hesitation. And hesitation in a place like that leads to delay, and delay leads to being caught in the same confusion that had already taken hold. The group fractured completely, not by choice, but by necessity. Smaller clusters formed, each believing they could find a better way, each moving in slightly different directions, each carrying the same uncertainty, the same lack of understanding. Kojo and Bako observed all of this, from positions that kept them unseen, from distances that allowed them to listen without being found, because they did not need to follow every movement, they only needed to understand the pattern, and the pattern was clear. The hunters were no longer a group, they were individuals, and individuals in that environment are far more vulnerable. The forest seemed to change with them, not physically, but in the way it was experienced. Paths that seemed open would close, sounds that suggested direction would mislead, spaces that looked safe would shift under pressure, one by one. The numbers continued to fall, not always through the same cause, sometimes the ground, sometimes confusion, sometimes the result of their own decisions, but always with the same outcome: absence, silence, disappearance. The voices that had once filled the forest were now scattered, distant, uncertain, some calling out, others no longer responding, because communication had broken down, replaced by isolation, and isolation, in a place like that, is dangerous. Kojo and Bako moved carefully toward the outer edges of the space they had created, not rushing, not revealing themselves, because their goal had never been confrontation, it had been escape, and now the conditions for that escape were complete. The hunters were no longer following them. They were trying to find their own way out, and failing. The last cluster of men attempted one final push, gathering themselves, choosing a direction based on instinct rather than knowledge, moving together in the hope that unity would restore some form of control. But unity without understanding is fragile, and it did not last. The ground shifted again, the space narrowed, the path they believed was clear turned uncertain, and in that moment, the final structure broke, not with a single event, but with the realization that there was no clear way forward, no clear way back, only the space they were already in, and that space was not theirs to control. Kojo and Bako reached the edge of the forest, not a clear boundary, not a line that could be seen easily, but a change in the land, a shift in how it felt, because they knew, they had learned, they understood where the forest ended and where open ground began. They did not look back, did not wait, did not pause, because looking back does not change what has already happened, and waiting only increases risk. They stepped out into a space where movement was different, where visibility returned, where the patterns they knew no longer held the same power. Behind them, the forest remained, silent, unchanged in appearance, but carrying everything that had happened within it. No bodies were brought out, no clear answers returned, only absence, only the knowledge that a large group had entered and did not return, and that absence became something else, a story, not fully understood, not clearly explained, but remembered, in fragments, in whispers, in the way people spoke about that place afterward, because places like that, once they carry events like this, are never seen the same way again. Kojo and Bako continued, not stopping, not settling, because survival does not end with escape. It continues, it adapts, it moves forward. But what they had done, what they had survived, what they had turned from pursuit into disappearance remained, not just as an event, but as a shift, a reminder that knowledge of the land, patience and understanding can overcome numbers, can overcome force, can overcome certainty. and as the forest stood behind them, holding its silence, keeping its secrets, one truth remained. No one who entered after that did so with the same confidence again. The aftermath did not begin with answers, it began with questions. Because when a large group leaves and does not return, when men who were expected to come back with others instead disappear without trace, the silence they leave behind becomes heavier than any explanation. The plantation that had sent them waited at first, expecting delay, expecting difficulty, because the forest was known to be challenging but not impossible, not something that would take so many without leaving any sign. Days passed, then more, and the waiting turned into concern, not spoken loudly, but present. Search parties were considered, then reduced, then delayed, because uncertainty creates hesitation, and hesitation grows when the unknown feels larger than the risk of waiting. When a smaller group was finally sent, they did not go deep. Not like the first, they stayed near the edges, calling out, searching for signs, but what they found was not clarity. It was absence. No clear path, no remains, no indication of what had happened. Only the same silence that had settled over the forest from the beginning. And that silence told them enough. They returned, without answers. And sometimes, no answer is more powerful than any explanation, because it leaves space for fear, for imagination, for stories to grow. The masters spoke carefully about what had happened, not wanting to admit loss, not wanting to show weakness, because control depends not just on reality, but on perception, and perception must be maintained. But word spread, not through official voices, but through movement, through workers, through traders, through those who carried pieces of information from one place to another, and the story began to take shape, not exactly as it happened, but in a way that carried its meaning. Two men, chased by many, entering the forest and not being caught. The number of hunters changed in different tellings, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, but the ending remained the same. They did not return. Kojo and Bako became something more than individuals, not in the sense of fame, not in the way names are written and recorded, but in the way stories are carried, through memory, through repetition, through the feeling that something important had happened, something that challenged what people believed was certain. Among the enslaved, the story held a different kind of power. Not because it promised escape for everyone, not because it suggested that the same thing could happen again easily, but because it showed that even in pursuit, even when outnumbered, there were ways to survive. Ways that did not rely on strength alone, but on understanding, on patience, on using what was already there. The forest itself became something else in people's minds, not just a place of danger, but a place of possibility, a space where the rules that applied outside did not always hold in the same way. But it was also respected, because what had happened there was not simple. It was not easy. It was not something that could be repeated without knowledge, without preparation, without understanding. The masters avoided speaking of it in detail. They reduced it, simplified it, called it loss, called it misfortune, because to describe it fully would be to admit that something beyond their control had occurred. And that was not something they were willing to accept openly, but their actions revealed the truth. They no longer sent large groups into that forest. They no longer assumed that numbers alone would guarantee success. They adjusted, quietly, carefully, because they understood, even if they did not say it, that something in that space had changed. Kojo and Bako continued their lives beyond that moment, not returning, not revealing themselves, because survival required distance, required movement, required staying beyond the reach of those who would try again. Their story did not follow them in a direct way. It remained behind, growing in the places where it had been heard, shaping understanding, influencing thought, becoming part of something larger than their individual lives. And that is how some stories become legend, not through exaggeration alone, but through meaning, through what they represent, through the way they shift perception. Because this was not just about escape, it was about turning a pursuit into something else entirely. turning control into confusion, turning numbers into weakness, turning certainty into doubt. And once doubt takes hold, it changes everything. The forest remained, silent, unchanged on the surface, but carrying a story that would be told in different ways, for years, for generations. Because some places do not just exist as land, they exist as memory, as warning, as proof, that even in situations that seem one-sided, there are moments where understanding outweighs force and changes the outcome completely. The legacy of what happened did not fade with time. It settled deeper, spreading quietly across plantations, across paths where stories traveled without needing to be written, carried by those who listened carefully, those who understood that not every truth is spoken openly. The forest was no longer seen the same way, not by the masters, not by the hunters, not even by those who had always lived near it, because what had happened there had changed its meaning, turned it from a simple place into something layered, something that carried uncertainty. Before it had been a challenge, now it was a question, a place where outcomes were no longer predictable, a place where control did not fully apply. And that difference mattered. The masters adjusted their behavior in ways they did not openly discuss. They reduced the scale of their pursuits, avoided sending large groups deep into unknown terrain, relied more on edges, on open ground, on spaces they believed they could still manage, because they understood something they had not understood before. That numbers alone do not guarantee success. That force without understanding can fail. And failure, when it happens in a visible way, creates doubt. Among the enslaved, the story continued to move, not as a promise, not as something that guaranteed escape, but as something that reshaped thinking, that showed that even in the most controlled situations, there are variables, there are unknowns, there are spaces where knowledge can create opportunity. Kojo and Bako became symbols, not in the sense of names repeated everywhere, but in the way their story was used, in the way it was remembered when people spoke quietly about what was possible, about what could happen when patience and understanding came together. Their survival was not seen as luck, it was seen as something earned, something built over time, something that required more than strength, it required awareness. The forest itself became part of that understanding, not just as a physical space, but as a concept, a reminder that the world is not the same everywhere, that control has boundaries, that systems built in one place do not always hold in another. And that idea spread slowly, quietly, but steadily. The masters, though they would never say it openly, carried a different kind of caution, not fear in the usual sense, but awareness, the kind that comes from experience, from realizing that there are situations where their usual methods do not work, and that awareness shaped their decisions, changed their approach, even if only slightly, even if only in certain situations. Time passed, new stories emerged, other events took place, but this one remained, not because of its scale alone, but because of what it revealed, because it showed something that could not be easily dismissed, that even when outnumbered, even when pursued, even when the odds seem fixed, there are still ways to change the outcome, and that understanding stayed, not always at the surface, but present, influencing thought, shaping perception, becoming part of the quiet knowledge carried by those who listened. Kojo and Bako themselves did not return to the story. They did not step back into the spaces where their actions had taken place, because survival meant continuing forward, not looking back, not revealing what had been done. But their absence did not weaken the story, it strengthened it, because absence creates mystery, and mystery allows meaning to grow. The forest remained, as it always had, trees, paths, ground that shifted with the seasons, but for those who knew, it was something more, a place where something had happened, something that changed how it was seen, how it was approached, how it was understood, and that change did not disappear, because once a place carries a story like that, it becomes part of it, forever. In the end, The story did not settle into a single version. It did not remain fixed in one telling, because stories like this do not stay still. They move. They change slightly as they pass from one person to another, but the core of it, the meaning of it, remains untouched. Two men, chased, outnumbered, expected to fail, and yet they did not. That is the part that stayed. Not every detail, not every step, but the outcome and the understanding that came with it. The plantation system continued as systems like that do, built to sustain itself, to adapt, to absorb what it could. But even within that continuation, there were changes, small ones, quiet ones, adjustments made not out of choice, but out of necessity. Because once something happens that cannot be explained easily, that cannot be controlled in the usual way, it forces those in power to reconsider, to move differently, even if they do not admit why. The masters never spoke of defeat. They never framed it that way, but they avoided repeating it, and that avoidance was its own kind of answer. Among the enslaved, the story lived on differently, not as something exaggerated for excitement, but as something carried with care, because it held meaning. It represented something real, something that could not be dismissed as simple chance. It showed that knowledge matters, that patience matters, that understanding the environment, the space, the timing, can change outcomes that seem fixed, and that understanding stayed, not loudly, but deeply. Kojo and Bako did not return to tell their story. They did not stand before others and explain what they had done. They did not become figures of public recognition, but that did not take away from what they had achieved. Because impact is not always measured by visibility. Sometimes it is measured by change, by the way people think differently after, by the way they carry new awareness into situations that once seemed certain. The forest remained, silent, unchanged in appearance, but forever different in meaning. Because now it was not just a place, it was a reminder that even in the most controlled systems, there are spaces where control weakens, where understanding becomes more powerful than force, where numbers lose their advantage, and where those who are underestimated can change everything. So when you think about this story, do not only think about the chase, do not only think about the hunters and their disappearance, think about what it reveals, what it teaches, what it leaves behind, because that is where the real power of the story exists. In its meaning, in its impact, in the way it shifts how we understand the past. Thank you for watching Story of the Black Past. If you stayed until this moment, I truly appreciate you. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time. And if you have not subscribed yet, take a moment to like and subscribe, because there are many more stories like this, stories that go beyond what is commonly known, stories that reveal what has been hidden. And remember this, not every victory is loud, not every triumph is seen, but some change everything simply by proving that what was expected was not the only possible outcome.